Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor, Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
And WPR associate editor, Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about a series of mysterious explosions that have rattled Iran over the past 3 weeks, as well as revelations that the Trump administration granted broad new powers to the CIA to carry out offensive cyber operations 2 years ago. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Sam Raghaveen about Australia's new defense strategy and the shifting balance of power in the Asia-Pacific. Freddie, it's been about 3 weeks now that we've been reading about this series of explosions in Iran. Some of them are targeting energy infrastructure and facilities. A couple others have hit a military facility and a nuclear site. They began in late June. They've continued steadily since then. It's still a mystery about what's happening, whether some of these are just random coincidences. But most people assume rightly or wrongly that somewhere and somehow the U.S. and or Israel is behind these explosions. And at a certain point, especially when it comes to domestic audiences and opinion in Iran, for instance, sometimes those appearances can be enough.
They can. And, there's obviously been a history as well of Israeli and also American sabotage and other forms of sort of clandestine interference in Iran, whether with its nuclear program or, other ways of trying to, not have full-on military intervention, but still there's a reason that these are the U.S. and Israel are the two, suspected, reasons behind these explosions. Again, lots of caveats. We don't actually know that. But the fact also that the U.S. and Israel, since the Trump administration came into office, it's been an increasingly hard line against Iran. And we know that Israel as well has sort of been looking for the right opportunity to escalate things with Iran, even after the Iran deal. The Trump administration withdrew the U.S. from the deal. So, I don't think any of this should necessarily be a surprise if we ever find out who's really behind them.
I mean, as recently as January, we were talking about the possibility of open conflict between the U.S. and Iran over the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general. And even in Syria, for instance, Israel has been increasingly open about airstrikes against bases where Iranian forces have been operating, just a way of enforcing its red lines in terms of how close it wants to allow Iranian forces to its border with Syria. And so again, with all those caveats, no one would be surprised if this was an extension of those tensions, whether on the part of the U.S., Iran, Israel, or both cooperating. I guess what struck me most about the idea that it could be the U.S. or Israel behind it is that they seem to be gambling that Iran was deterred by the Soleimani killing, to which Iran engaged in a pretty limited non-escalation, face-saving missile barrage against bases in Iraq where U.S. forces are operating. But there's this gamble that basically either Iran is deterred or else they're really exercising strategic patience and restraint until the November election in the U.S. to avoid the possibility of conflict before that. In either case, it seems like a risky gamble, and it doesn't seem like there's any real long-term vision or strategy behind it. No real long-term objectives. The damage to the military and nuclear facilities, it's still uncertain how far that might have put Iran back in its nuclear program or its missile program. But in any case, it doesn't seem like there's much real that there's been much serious thought put to what the end goal is. I've seen some speculation that it's actually to humiliate the Iranian regime and maybe even try to trigger some sort of domestic uprising against a regime that's perceived as unable to even secure its highest value military sites. Prachi, I guess it makes me wonder what your take is on this question of triggering an uprising from the outside with this kind of sabotage or things like that. I mean, is outside agitation and interference an effective means of regime change, and is it an advisable one?
Regardless of whether the U.S. is trying to and Israel are trying to provoke regime change, there's a lot of desire to oppose the regime within Iran from Iranian dissenters. After Soleimani's killing, there was actually, and after the downing of the passenger jet around the same time, there was a huge burst of dissent again, and a lot of protesting. And at the time, it was Masia Alinejad, who's an Iranian activist, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where she wrote that a lot of Western media kind of underestimates the anger and resentment over crackdowns from last year's protests, saying that, quote, "I and others have been saying for years that the current repressive conditions in the country are not tenable and that more protests would break out. We were right, and I'll say it again, don't be fooled. Iran will see more anti-regime protests." So I think there is a huge desire for some kind of change, some kind of increased political space coming from the public there. Experts have explained that since May 2017, dissent has become more and more frequent in Iran. You think of protests over corruption, protests over fuel price hikes, protests over women's rights with the White Wednesday movements where women were taking off of their hijabs in public. So there does seem to be this need coming from the public as well. And, it's possible that if it becomes clear that the U.S. or Israel are actively trying to provoke regime change, that could undermine these movements to an extent because it gives the regime a reason to go after them as foreign provocateurs or something like that. But you can't make Iranians forget that they have this desire to dissent as well. So to some extent, I think that spirit is still going to be powerful, and that on its own will provoke some protests.
It's a good point, and at the same time, the Iranian people over the past 3 years, and especially since Trump reimposed sanctions on Iran, have been caught between a rock and the hard place of this repressive regime, where there has been wide and in some cases sustained protest against it, but at the same time, these punishing sanctions by the U.S. that are making the entire population suffer. And Freddy, we saw that sort of whiplash effect after the Soleimani killing, where there was an immediate outpouring of support for the regime. And then after, as Prachi mentioned, after the downing of the Ukrainian passenger plane that was carrying mainly Iranian nationals, it immediately whiplashed into protests against the regime. What are your thoughts if it does come out, let's say, that the U.S. or Israel is behind this? Does this undermine the government to the population because it's too weak to prevent it, or does it create that sort of nationalist rally around the flag reaction that strengthens a regime that it's important to mention has become much more hardline after the most recent parliamentary elections and just the general trend in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have both impacts among different, segments of Iranian society. I think still that, this wouldn't be the first time that the U.S. and Israel have thought that they could, foment regime change or revolution, quote unquote, in Iran by trying to destabilize the country or through some sort of, external meddling. And I think that idea is totally misguided. it comes from very hawkish writers in the United States, for example, who purely see Iran through this regime change lens, and that's not to in any way obviously soft pedal the nature of the Iranian regime and also the fact that it has gotten even more hardline. But the idea that Iranians are already protesting, as Prachi noted. I mean, there's been waves of protests over the last several years. The Trump administration has clearly tried to sort of instrumentalize them and seize on them, but there hasn't been any indication that Iranians, obviously they would support and want international, solidarity and backing, especially if they're, being shot in the streets or, there's other forms of repression. But Iranians don't also want to welcome, foreign sabotage. And in a country where, there's a long history of U.S. meddling, most notoriously, obviously, the CIA's actions in Iran in the 1950s. The idea from hawks in the U.S. and also from Israel that, Iranians themselves are sort of just, it sort of treats them like they're sort of pawns for U.S. interests. And as long as the U.S. intervenes and embarrasses the regime or, can foment some kind of rebellion, A, Iranians would go along with it, and B, that it would lead to, some sort of preferred American outcome in Tehran, which there's no guarantee of that. So I think the entire thing, if it comes to that, is just another sign of how misguided this part of U.S. policy in Iran is.
I guess I'd just underscore that question of preferred U.S. outcomes. It's certainly regime change, and if this series of explosions is a U.S. covert operation, it definitely would seem to have, and I guess also I'd add that if it's an Israeli operation, I suspect that they would have to have the U.S. sign off on it in terms of at least alerting and probably getting something of a green light. And if that either of those is the case, it would strike me that it has Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's fingerprints all over it. And I'd argue John Bolton's, because it's probably the sort of thing that's been in the planning stages for quite some time. And there was this idea that once Bolton was fired as national security advisor, that the worst danger that he posed to making U.S. policy, especially toward Iran, more hawkish was over. If it comes out that this is a U.S. operation, I'd argue that he probably had quite a bit to do with it. And that question of what happens after regime change is why I say that there doesn't seem to be much real serious thought about a long-term strategy, because regime change, as we saw in Iraq, is really just the beginning. And for an American electorate that really has no appetite right now for the kind of long-term commitment it would take to stabilizing in Iran after regime change, it really just opens the door either to a worse regime taking the place of this one, or else just chaos as we've seen elsewhere. So for those reasons, I'm sort of skeptical about the objectives if it does turn out to be a U.S. or Israeli operation. I guess that topic kind of leads us into the second one, which is this blockbuster story by four reporters, Zach Dorfman, Kim Zetter, Jenna McLaughlin, and Sean Naylor, working for Yahoo News, about these broad CIA cyber operations. Their article details how Trump authorized the agency in 2018 to conduct covert cyber operations, but offensive operations against Iran, as well as other U.S. adversaries like Russia, China, and North Korea, which again sort of makes it more and more likely that what's going on in Iran is actually that there's some U.S. hand in it. The important distinction here too is that the authorization for these operations was a standing authorization, basically empowering the CIA to launch particular cyber operations and cyber attacks without further clearance or policy debate in terms of the interagency process or in the National Security Agency. or rather in the National Security Council in the White House. And according to their report, it included hack and dump operations similar to what Russia and WikiLeaks do, as well as cyber attacks against critical infrastructure like energy installations, something we've seen in Iran over the last 3 weeks. Freddy, immediate thoughts about some of the implications, risks, dangers, unintended consequences?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems it's in terms of reporting, it's shocking in just how detailed it is, and just the nature of the revelation. It also just further shows how much more aggressive U.S. policy toward Iran has become under Trump. The list of demands that they put to the Iranian regime after the U.S. withdrew from the Iran deal was, this wishful thinking. It's also, I think we've talked about it before as like basically a surrender list that Iran, basically can have normal relations with the U.S. if they do, this laundry list of American demands, which of course Iran won't. And so it's been clear that the policy is not anything but regime change and this extremely sort of militarized, aggressive pressure campaign. The fact that it now includes cyber attacks and a standing order that the CIA can basically do what it wants in that realm is, extremely risky in terms of what kind of how it could escalate further. The other question too, as well. I know that Russia and China and other countries, or I believe China, maybe it was just North Korea, are mentioned in that reporting. But it also just the contrast with how aggressive they're being against Iran versus just how far Trump and others in his administration have gone to not take similar action against Russia, even though Russia's interference in the election in 2016 and other actions are far more egregious than anything Iran has done, arguably. That contrast, I just think, is even more jarring, that the Trump administration is almost going out of its way to not take a harder line against Russia while going far beyond what even a normal pressure campaign against Iran, I think, would look like.
I'd just add a couple thoughts. One is that we do know that the NSA, the National Security Agency, that's in generally in charge of cyber, went after the unit in Russia that was responsible for some of the interference in the 2016 election. In the run-up to the 2018 midterm elections. I think they took them offline for a day or two, just as sort of a brushback pitch. But for sure, unless it's gone unreported, we don't know of any attacks against installations, for instance, in Russia, which would obviously run a whole different set of risks in terms of escalation and potential conflict. I guess with regard to the reporting in this article, I'd say that there are a lot of very serious concerns in terms of oversight and the planning behind the operations, because it seems like it's just been fast and furious. It said that in some cases, operations that would normally take a year to go through the interagency process and get authorization have been up and running in a couple weeks. So there's a real danger there, obviously, of things getting a little gonzo and a little cowboy in the CIA. I do think in some ways I think that there were some necessary changes that had to be made in terms of making the U.S. a little more proactive, a little more reactive. I think there was a certain need for the U.S. to take the gloves off and really let some of these countries know that it is willing to take a less risk-averse posture. It also kind of puts the U.S. in a more of a disruptor role that Russia has enjoyed playing, as opposed to a defender role. I think where the real dangers come in addition to obviously, I'd like to see more of like a compromise between 1 year and 2 weeks. 2 weeks between someone hatching an idea and putting it into play at the CIA seems quite risky. The big thing that I'd be worried about is this question of norms and precedents. You mentioned the criteria that the U.S. Or the conditions the U.S. put on negotiations with Iran, and it basically amounted to Iran no longer being a quote unquote rogue state. And really towing the line and following some of these international norms that the U.S. At least pays lip service to. And I think that this shows that in a lot of ways it is lip service. These are extra legal operations. They're clearly the kinds of operations that the U.S. would condemn if it were Iran or any of these other countries doing them. So there's that, the U.S. sort of normalizing itself and in the sense of leveling itself down. And then there's also the question of what it says about the range of targets available to U.S. adversaries. If the U.S. is targeting critical infrastructure in other countries, it means that it can't really complain that much if the same kind of infrastructure is targeted in the U.S. We know from some reporting that Iran had recently targeted Israel's water distribution systems, for instance. I think that the U.S. would be very alarmed to learn to know that adversaries were targeting those kind of systems in the U.S. And in fact, there was some reporting that the Russians were sort of feeling out some of those facilities and even maybe trying to place malware and things like that, put it in place in the event that they need it. So again, I think that the real question here is the degree to which it erodes those kinds of norms and precedents that the U.S. in the past has really tried to uphold and promulgate.
Yeah, and it's also, in the absence of a clear diplomatic goal, which, U.S. pressure and coercion and using these sorts of tools, I might understand a little bit more if it was very clear to get Iran to negotiate something very concrete. There isn't any clear diplomatic goal, and I think that that's partly not just with Iran, but this is a broader situation with the Trump administration, that they're using either sanctions previously, but now, covert action and other, hard forms of power, but to what aim? And unless there's a diplomatic goal in mind, or this is a tool of diplomacy, it just seems aggressive and punitive and and a lot more likely to lead to blowback.
Yeah, although the Trump administration is increasing the cybersecurity budget to an extent, it seems like it's also hesitant to address some of these cybersecurity issues like potential election interference. So I guess it's a question for the two of you. Do you think that if cyber warfare escalates as a result of these actions, is the U.S. prepared to deal with that and battle on that front?
Well, I think that in general, the U.S. has more deterrence than other countries. It has an enormous array of cyber capabilities. At the same time, the U.S. has more at stake and at risk than most countries because of its commitment to open elections, for instance, because of the range of infrastructure and the degree to which the American economy is online, and the way in which the private sector in the U.S. And protecting the private sector in the U.S. in terms of cyber security is a very complicated thing. The U.S. government and military or militarized cyber defense does not apply to the private sector, and it's a very complicated problem to try to nudge or require the private sector to secure its cyber capabilities or its online infrastructure to the degree that would make it able to withstand those kind of attacks. I mean, we've seen the kinds of, identity theft and the breaches in, for instance, credit agencies and credit risk agencies and things like that, and how hard it is. And a lot of these business models would become unprofitable if they had to actually spend what they need to spend on cybersecurity. I guess I'd kick a question right back to you, Prachi, and this question of a slippery slope, and if the U.S. is becoming this kind of actor in cyberspace, hacking and dumping information and material, for instance, and essentially breaking the law or violating international law, arguably. For you, what are the implications of that kind of Wild West environment in cyberspace for instance, online activists or social movements or pro-democracy movements in other countries that might be targeted by the U.S. or not, but where the environment is already somewhat hostile? How much can the U.S. then become a defender of cyberspace and norms in cyberspace that these kind of activists are looking for?
I don't know if the U.S. has been truly a defender of norms in cyberspace, at least for activists. I think that the activists are already kind of in the Wild West in that way, where many of them are targeted by groups like NSO Group, and there's not really a lot of international law or regulations to prevent activists from being targeted by attacks like that. And I'm forgetting the exact details, but I know that some of the previous WikiLeaks also put some activists and private citizens at risk, because essentially these huge tracts of data are just being dumped online without really paying attention to the content. And some of that content can actually endanger private citizens living in closed societies. So I think it brings up a lot of privacy issues, and, just so far, regulations just aren't keeping up with all the dangers that activists and private citizens are facing online. So I think to the U.S., to the extent that the U.S. is stooping down to a lower level with these kinds of attacks and deteriorating norms, as you suggested, it's definitely not trending in the right direction.
All right. I'm sure there's going to be some follow-up reporting on this story, and probably some revelations having to do with this series of explosions in Iran as well. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. All right. Now it's time to get to some WPR articles that we'd like to flag for everyone listening. Freddie, which one did you have in mind?
The latest briefing by Jeremy Yu on the race for a COVID-19 vaccine and a lot of the problems around it that are less to do with the vaccine specifically and how it gets distributed. As Jeremy writes, developing a vaccine is one thing, but making it available to people is another issue altogether, one that involves thorny questions of ethics, intellectual property rights, global trade, and recouping research costs.
And Prachi?
I wanted to mention this week's feature by Christopher Sabatini, who writes on the toll that the coronavirus is taking on informal workers. Workers in the informal economy, he writes, are more than cogs in the wheels of production. They are often crucial components of economic activity. Restrictions on informal sector activity, or worse, the collapse of the sector, would imperil food security and economic stability beyond the workers themselves, dampening broader demands and levels of production. But Chris says that the solutions in place so far, mainly direct cash transfers for short-term aid, are not enough to help these workers and fix the broader economy. He says that what we need instead is a new social contract that will address the structural weaknesses that created the informal sector in the first place.
And I'll mention Edward Alden's guest column this week about the meeting last week between Donald Trump and Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador to launch the updated North America Free Trade Agreement, now known as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Ted points out what's missing from the New Deal, the North America part. It's a reflection, he says, of how relations between the three neighbors have devolved into suspicious nationalism. But as he also explains, NAFTA's vision of regional cooperation always remained shallow, limited to the country's business communities and excluding the free movement of people. Ted writes, quote, "The good news in all of this is that the trade relationship within North America remains quite strong, but the new name of the deal says it all. There is no North America anymore, just three sovereign countries uneasily sharing the same continent," unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddie, why don't you kick things off?
All right, this is who it's about. It's a pity she didn't use her political capital earlier, because she'll be gone, and the jury is very much out on how much of her party is happy to move with her.
Oh, I think I have an idea. Prachi?
I'm not sure.
I'm going to say it's Angela Merkel.
It is. A story about, which we've mentioned before, Merkel changing some of her views on what Europe should do collectively to deal with the economic crisis of the pandemic. But the fact that she doesn't have a successor in her party, they might not actually really go along with this new direction that she's headed in.
Major European Council meeting of heads of state and government taking place as we speak, if I'm not mistaken. And Prachi, what do you got for us?
Okay, so I think I might have broken the rules for this one, but I just found it really funny. So it's something that's kind of become a meme, so you can just name the country that it comes from. So here's the quote. "There's just no way not to scream. It's kind of torture to be back at your favorite place in the world and to not be able to scream and enjoy everything 100%.
I have no idea.
It's about a country, right? Specifically? Or a place?
Yeah, you can say what kind of country it comes from. Yeah.
I guess I want to think on the one hand it's about like Disney World because they reopened and I know it was a bit of a nightmare. But I think it might also be other countries that reopen theme parks or something where that's very strict protocols for riding roller coasters or something. But I can't remember where it is.
Yeah, exactly. So this was an amusement park goer in Japan where some amusement parks have asked guests to, quote, "please scream inside your heart" instead of out loud to avoid spreading the coronavirus. And one social media poster said that "please scream inside your heart" is basically the slogan of 2020.
I was going to say, isn't that what we've been doing? All right, here's mine. And you need to either get the person or country speaking the quote or who they are speaking about. Here's the quote. "Criticize Trump, the U.S., for the lack of democracy. Try to do it with Russia. Solve your own problems first, and there are many of them." Anyone?
I don't know. Yeah, there's too many potential. I could take a guess, but I don't know.
Prachi?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I could guess, but I'm not confident about my guesses.
Well, the syntax is obviously a strong man, authoritarian leader. This one in particular is Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko.
That was what I was thinking.
Really? All right. He was responding to an EU delegation that criticized the country's election commission for excluding Lukashenko's two major opponents from the presidential, scare quotes, election scheduled for August 9th. Lukashenko is not exactly known for allowing dissent and free elections, and it seems like this time will be no exception. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, You'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.